You know, it can be hard replacing certain relics in our lives, but I think it was time for this one to go, and I think you'll like the new look. My son recalled getting this in the 4th grade, and these guys have been playing on this for far too long. So in this video, I'm going to take their game to the next level by building a one-of-a-kind, portable, glow-in-the-dark, epoxy, and wood game console. Here we go. Okay, before we get started, let me make a quick little admission. When I start these projects, I rarely know where I'm going to end up when it's all said and done. So just so you know, there's going to be some things that I learn along the way, which I'm okay with because I think it helps to drive the conversation. It allows people an opportunity to ask questions if they're learning something and I know what it is, and it allows me to be challenged in some ways so that I can ultimately be a better woodworker and therefore provide better content to you, which helps maybe you be a better woodworker. And because this channel is more family oriented and I'd like to keep it kid friendly, there have been a few comments where I've had to respond a little bit more strategically due to the overall culture of the channel. That said, I do appreciate your perspective, and I'll continue asking questions from time to time or inquiring of your opinion on these projects. Here's the question for today. Chess or checkers? What do you prefer? Let me bring you up to speed on where we are in the build. What you saw me do there first was break down a piece of cedar wood, and I broke that down into 1.5-inch blocks. Now these blocks, because this is a cedar wood and epoxy chessboard or checkers board, were meant to form every other piece on the board, and then everything else was supposed to be filled in with clear epoxy. I ended up using a blue pigment, and I'll talk about that later. But in the meantime, I kept a couple of these woodworking squares handy so I could measure each block as I put them in place, so to keep this as perfectly square as possible. And then the next step was to build a form so that I could actually pour the epoxy. So I used the same kind of board material and cut down a few strips to create a barrier. This will all end up being either cut off or sanded down once the epoxy's cured. In addition to this form, and in preparation for pouring the epoxy, I dressed each block plus all the sides, the corners of the form itself with an initial layer of quick cure epoxy. This is an extra measure that helps seal the wood, ultimately preventing any air from escaping from the wood and causing bubbles in the epoxy when it's poured. It also helps to secure the edges of the form so that the epoxy doesn't leak. If you know how it feels to watch epoxy run, then trust me, this is a technique you'll want to try. As upsetting as it is to watch epoxy fall into the abyss, also known as my garage floor, it's equally as satisfying to finally discover a process that results in no drips. If you notice, there's a decent amount of dead space on the outside of where the chessboard will be. That was intentional to have at first because I wanted a little extra room when it came to squaring up the board at the end. What I wasn't tracking, however, was how much epoxy I had, and turns out I wouldn't have had enough to fill up the dead space and fill the board all the way up. So I cut off a few more sacrificial pieces and put those in on the sides. This is ultimately going to help me have more epoxy in the areas where I want it. Now let's talk epoxy. I noticed these little floaty thingies in my epoxy. I have no idea what this is. I did try to stir them in gently and then a little bit more aggressively, and after thinking about it for a minute, I just decided to go with it. I wonder if this is the epoxy hardening over time or maybe meeting its shelf life. I don't know. If you have any insight on this though, feel free to let me know. I would definitely appreciate it. The original idea, like I said earlier, was for this to be a clear epoxy and cedar wood chessboard, but because of the floaty thingies, I pulled out the blue pigment and thought worst case scenario, we can go with a blue cobalt and cedar wood chessboard instead. That sounds cool too. If I'm being totally transparent, I tried using the blue only in the areas where there were floaty thingies. It would be cool to just let the blue flow, I thought, beyond those areas and create its own shape, but yeah, it wasn't working out, so I kind of just went all in on the blue cobalt idea. And although it wasn't originally what I planned, I still think it turned out okay. At this point in the build, I started bringing this inside every day to hang out on my dining room table because of how cold it was outside. I found myself taking pictures of this on the way out the door to work. Why? I don't know. To have it to stare at, I guess. Please tell me I'm not the only one that does that. Also, at this point, it was time to get these sides cut down. But first, my table saw seemed very resistant to go up and down the way that it was supposed to, and I couldn't figure out at first what was going on. I stopped to maintenance that, and I found these small pieces lodged into the saw. I've seen a few videos on YouTube about a zero clearance insert. Maybe it's about time for me to make one of those. Anyway, for now, I released these two little gremlins from our operation, and I got back to work. It was time to get these sides cut off and see if we could bring this to life. If you're still here with us, I'd like to say thanks for hanging out. And if you're enjoying the video, make sure to give us that thumbs up and subscribe so that you can take part in some of the future content that we'll have. My overall goal in woodworking is to build creativity with family and community, while also encouraging those who feel challenged to create, like myself. We've got to push ourselves if we're going to realize our passions, and that's what this channel is all about. Your interaction is going to be vital to its success, and like I said, I'll do my part by interacting back and forth in some of the comments and making sure to give quality future content. Okay, let's catch up on our build. Did you notice we took some weight off? Remember, we had to sand down the bottom piece that was used to initially glue down our blocks. Now, it was always my intention to sand that piece down, but a good practice is always to start with a little bit more wood if you can on projects like this, because usually through the sanding process it'll get smaller anyway. As you work to reduce imperfections and make the board level, you're going to lose some thickness from your board. Here's a 323 pro tip for you. Occasionally you'll have projects where you notice small holes and gaps in the knots or in the wood itself. Don't waste your time trying to fill those right away. At least wait until you get the board to final size, because there's a good chance that you end up sanding away all the work you did only to have to do it again. Here I'm using CA glue again, this time mixing in our Cobalt Glue Epoxy and filling in some of the wood knots. Small imperfections like this you can sometimes fill in with whatever application you plan to use, but I thought it would add a little bit more character to have a couple extra showings of blue where we could. Speaking of application, I used shellac for the first time, and this stuff dries extremely fast. It's a little hard to work with, but I think because it sealed the wood so well, I was able to give it a quick sanding and put a thick layer of polyurethane, and it turned out fantastic. So shellac might be the MVP here. Now it was time to build our base. To start to form the base, I cut off 4 sides to form the edges And then, because I didn't have any flat wood, I just ripped up a bunch of 1/4 inch pieces and then glued them all back up, much like a cutting board. That will act as our base and hopefully make a little bit more sense here in just a second. While I'm gluing these up, let me pause and give a shout out to the person who actually gave me this cedar wood. You know who you are. I'm not going to say your name. I just wanted to say thank you. I also want to point out to those of you who are watching the video, talk about what you do. Talk about your passion, your craft, talk about your hobby, because it will push you to continue to get better at whatever it is that you want to do. And you might actually score some good deals on product or opportunities. When I first started, I would go to Woodcraft, and even though they have a lot of really good products there that are good for woodworking, I found that that is probably the most expensive way to buy wood. All I'm saying is you've got Facebook Marketplace, Nextdoor app, and just word of mouth, which could be better options. If you talk about what you do, you might actually find some better deals. You might hear some other woodworkers out there tell you to start with chain link stores, but I'm going to be upfront and honest with you. You can find much better deals if you take the time to look for them. I know it's way easier to just go out and buy what's on the shelf. If you do it that way, you'll probably phase yourself out of woodworking pretty fast. Okay, that's enough fact talk for one video. Here's those side strips for our base that obviously I trimmed up on the table saw and then took through the drum sander to make it a little smoother. The last thing to do on these was to cut our mitered edges. I was proud of this because this is me advancing my skill set a little bit and putting some 45-degree angles on here. I inched in just a little bit at a time so that I didn't go over, and the tape helps me avoid chip out, as you can see here. I did end up going just a hair over, and you'll see how I correct that in just a little bit. I also went a little overkill on the CA glue here, so I'm hoping that mistake can be to your enjoyment. Here's an ASMR moment for you. So I actually wanted to put a small profile on the inside. These extra little pieces are going to help enforce the bottom box to the side. I had this fear that the bottom would just fall out. I don't know why, because wood glue is pretty strong, but I thought maybe those little extra pieces would help give a little bit more strength. So I went ahead and installed those, put an extra little bead of glue around this, sanded it in just to help fill in some of the small cracks. I did the same thing on the mitered edges, a little bead of glue, a little sawdust creation, a little magic, and voila, these were all good to go. The next step was to check the orientation from the top to the bottom, and we were on the home stretch. All that was left to do was to add our hardware, and this project was complete. In addition to the 3 clamps that you'll see me put on the board, which are meant to hold the top and the bottom together, I thought about how is somebody going to carry this around, and to my imagination it felt a little bulky. So I found this U-shaped bracket at Menards. I cut off what we didn't need and I plan to use it as a handle. It's a strange thought, but for whatever reason in my head, if something has a handle, it feels more official. So of course, this had to have a handle. In the same line of thought, if something has lights, it feels more cool. So of course, this had to have lights. Here in a second, you'll see what those look like. We'll get our hardware installed and we'll wrap up another one from 323. Before I get out of here, of course I need to say, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart. Now go create something amazing.
tape on your finger?
Because I cut my finger. You gonna go get me another Band-Aid?
You didn't cut your finger. Oh, you did cut your finger. Ew! Why would you use tape?
That's all I had.